What's up, Broncos country? Welcome back to the Broncos Podcast Network and YouTube for the latest episode of Broncos Now. As always, I'm your host, Sydney Jones. And coming up on today's episode, fellow team reporter Phil Milani joins the show. We'll talk about the Pro Bowl as Pat Surtain, Justin Simmons, and Marvin Mims Jr. head down to Orlando for that this week and look ahead to the Senior Bowl. All that and more coming up. Joining me here in the Broncos podcast studio for today's episode of Broncos Now is a fellow team reporter, Phil Milani. Phil, thanks for joining the show today.
Sid.
2 weeks in a row with Phil on the show.
Thanks for having me. It must have been good last week.
It was great last week, per usual.
Yeah,
well, happy to have you on again.
Thank you very much.
How we doing?
Doing good, yeah. Some exciting games last week.
Yeah.
Now the Super Bowl matchup is set.
Mm-hmm.
I think most of Broncos country probably agrees that you don't want to see the Chiefs win another one. But I think
Another
also
Chiefs
at this
Super
point,
Bowl.
you're just like, they're really good. So you just kind of deal with it.
Well, I think a lot of people were thinking maybe this was an off year for them.
Yeah,
so.
exactly. Turns out not so much.
Not so much, yeah. They always find a way to pull through in the end.
Yeah, Andy Reid,
those were good
Patrick
games.
Mahomes, those two together, you're always going to be in it. So, and then a
they
lot
were
of
good games on
Broncos
Sunday.
connections with the 49ers.
With the 49ers,
so,
yeah, I'm excited for them.
Yeah, we'll have to see how things play out. A rematch from a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
But very different teams.
2019?
Yeah, I think, So, it should be a
very
good
different
game.
teams now. Yeah, it should be.
A lot
Should
of
be fun.
excitement to talk about for 2 weeks here. So,
Yeah, well, we still have 2 weeks for that, but there's a lot going on in the football world this week, Phil.
Yeah.
Pro Bowl's coming up in Orlando this week. So Pat Surtain, Justin Simmons, Marvin Mims, they will all be down there in Orlando.
Yeah,
I
exciting
believe,
for those guys.
Yeah, really exciting. There's a skill showdown for them on Thursday, and then the game is on Sunday.
Yeah, there's all kinds of different things leading up to the Pro Bowl
I know.
now. So
There's community events, there's different practices and all that.
Fastest man competitions and
I know.
all
I don't know what the skills
stuff.
are this year.
So
those are always
all
fun.
kinds of different things.
I know last year, Pat Surtain, what did he, zip line through Vegas
exactly.
or something?
Yeah, no, that was kind of cool.
Yeah, that was cool.
Growing up, my favorite was the quarterback competition where they'd have the targets on the golf carts and stuff, and those old school quarterbacks, they would take that thing pretty seriously. Yeah, so it was fun to always see that.
That is fun. They haven't done that in a while, have they?
I know. Yeah, they kind of went away from that,
did.
but I think that's kind of fun too.
That is. Well, of course, Peyton Manning will be there too.
Yeah, coaching against his brother.
Yeah. Him and Eli.
Well, Eli won it last year, I think.
I think so too. Maybe it's Peyton's year then.
Yes, that's the bounce back.
Of course.
Yeah, can't let the
Can't
little
let your
bro.
brother.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, it should be fun
Get
though.
the leg up, but yeah,
we
good
got
for those guys.
some people going down there too. Ike, Ben Swanson,
Nicole. We'll have coverage. Yeah,
we'll have coverage there. So fans be on the lookout all week.
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity where
Yeah.
you're always around these guys, they're always taking things so seriously, getting ready for games or, their training, and they kind of have a focused mindset. This week, it's a lot more loose when you're around those guys, so you can do some fun stuff with them. And I think
practices are fun, they're loose,
Yeah, exactly. So everybody's having a good time, and I think that you get to see a different side of those guys during this week at the Pro Bowl.
Yeah, I think so too. So fans be on the lookout on denverbroncos.com and our social media channels. There'll be fun stuff coming this week from that.
Most
also,
definitely.
Phil, the Senior Bowl, that is this Saturday in Mobile.
Yeah.
The East-West Shrine Bowl, that's this Thursday. So a lot of stuff kind of going on this week.
Yeah, and I think a lot of focus is in Mobile right now during these practices. That's where, scouts really get a good look at these guys. And, of course, a lot of players at the Broncos could be interested in drafting, a couple of quarterbacks down there, Michael Penix, Bo Nix. Those guys are going to get a lot of attention, I think. And so you want to see what kind of weeks they have during this practice, what kind of, how do they carry themselves? How do they go about practice? How serious are they? What are they like in these meetings? There's a lot going on this week, and it's really, a big week for some of those guys. We mentioned it last week, Cindy, for some guys who are sort of unknown, but even guys who are known, like Bo Nix, he was a Heisman finalist, but this is a chance for him to show guys hey, I can do this at the next level. I can prove, you get to prove yourself a little bit. So definitely a big week for the Broncos and for those guys down there.
Yeah, show some of the executives in person what they can do.
Yeah, exactly.
A lot of times it's hard to get to these college games throughout the season.
Yeah, and there's I think maybe some people wonder why do scouts go to games? Like, what are they doing? Why can't they just watch it on TV, you know? But I feel like when you're on the field with these guys, you get such a different perspective.
100%.
You know, you could always look up on a piece of paper how tall a guy is, how much do they weigh. But when you are around some of them, you can feel a different presence. Some of these guys, despite what their size is or whatever, they have a different feel to them when they're on the field. And you also get a chance to see what kind of leader are these guys. What are they like, you know, in the huddles? What are they like during practice? What you just get a better picture of what a guy is and
who they are.
So much of success, I feel like, in the NFL comes down to those kind of different attributes, you know. Everybody's super athletic. Everybody's super physical. Everybody can lift a lot of weights. But what are the factors that really separate you? That's where you're getting a feel of those things when you're on the field with them in person.
I think so, too. Yeah, Phil, you mentioned quarterbacks. Outside of that, what other position groups do you think should be on the Broncos' radar as they're looking at some of these prospects?
Definitely like along the defensive line. I think that's going to be you know, a big focus this offseason. Just with the issues the Broncos had trying to stop the run last season, I think that's, you know, that was certainly an issue that popped up several times throughout the year. I think you could look to add a piece there to maybe an edge rusher, just something along the defensive front seven. I think that's an area the Broncos could go early in the draft or address in some form or fashion this offseason.
Free agency,
that's an area where, you know, when I watch the games this week, you know, like the conference championship games, I always like see what these teams are doing. Then I think about the Broncos and you're like, oh gosh, these teams have like some pieces at different spots where maybe the Broncos could look to address. So edge is a kind of a position where you're really impacting the game, you know, and making a difference week in and week out. And I think that's not to say anything about, you know, the guys that the Broncos have. I think that some of those younger players really stepped up. Nick Benito, Jonathan Cooper, you know, Browning. These guys really stepped up this year. But if you have a chance to get a guy who's like a focus for the opposing offense during the whole week, the way that Khalil Mack is, Myles Garrett. You think about the guys that Sean Payton was asked about, okay, what are you going to do to deal with Max Crosby? You know, how are you going to deal with Bosa? These kind of guys, you're like, okay, maybe this Broncos defense could just add a player like that who's going to be a focus for opposing offenses during the week. You know, they obviously have Surtain, which is a focus right now. Justin Simmons, he's a focus. But somebody up front. That could be a game wrecker. That's something where I think the Broncos can focus on. And, you know, the Broncos are going to have to find some pieces, Sid, not just with their first pick, not just with their third round pick, but in the fourth round, the fifth round. If you can really hit in those areas, that's where some of these teams start to separate themselves, where they're finding legitimate talent later in the draft, guys that end up becoming Pro Bowlers, becoming all-pro guys. If you can find that talent in some of these areas, that's where you can really separate your team. And that's what the Senior Bowl is about, is finding guys like that.
100%. Yeah, Phil, you're talking about edge rushers. First off, you can never have enough of them.
Yeah,
and I know George Payton has said that time and again too. But you know, Jonathan Cooper, who you mentioned, I mean, he was the 7th round pick. So like you said, I mean, you're going to find these guys later in the draft.
And you know, like a third round is like sort of like that end of that top 100 picks. You're going to find some guys there like a Quinn Miners or even a Justin Simmons who like develop into these, you know, perennial Pro Bowl, all-pro kind of consideration type of players, you know. But if you can find guys a little bit later than that come in and are key contributors, I think that's how you build depth. That's how you build your roster, where you're not spending a ton of money on those guys. They're not like some of these high-priced free agents that you bring in. Those are guys that are solid contributors that really make a difference. And, you know, that starts at weeks like this, where you're finding guys that you
under the
uncover
radar.
gems, you know, that kind of thing. Those are really big deals for teams that win a lot.
For sure. Well, Phil, looking ahead more into the offseason, you mentioned those high-priced free agents. You know, they made a big splash in free agency last year. I know George Payton kind of said in his end of the season press conference won't be as splashy this year.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you can't do that every year, I think is what you said. And, when you have a new head coach coming in like they did last year, they obviously identified the offensive line and they were like, okay, we got to get better along the offensive line. They picked up 2 starters in free agency. They picked up Samaje Perine. He was a big-time contributor, especially in the passing game, third down blocking. He was a big contributor to the offense. Jarrett Stidham, they brought in a free agency, ended up starting the last couple of games. So the guys that they went out and spent that money on, they played significantly for the Broncos last year. But like George said, you can't do that every year. And hopefully, I think having Sean in the building for 1 year under their belt now, they know what kind of players Sean Payton is looking for. This is a Sean Payton type of player. This is the mold of what they're looking for. That helps your scouts out where 100%. You can just feel it and be like, this guy has what it takes to be a Bronco. This is what the mold is like. You talk about that with like the Steelers that have so much consistency at their head coaching spot. They can easily identify this is what makes a Steeler. The longer that Sean's here, the more he's here, that's just going to help the scouts out during this process where they're like, we're looking for hard-nosed guys that are mentally tough, that are just good, solid football players. Not necessarily the fastest guy, not necessarily the biggest guy, but this guy fits the mold of what we're looking for. This guy's a Bronco.
This guy's a Denver Bronco.
Exactly. Those kind of things are going to become clearer and clearer the longer Sean Payton's here.
Yeah, I think so too. Just knowing what his culture is and what he wants.
Exactly. And, Sean has a long track record of finding guys later in the draft. And that's because he knows what he's looking for. And
he can
even
see
like
it, he
identifies like a Jaleel McLaughlin, you know what I mean? Obviously, he's speedy and brings that physical part of the game, where you can tell that he's a little bit faster than some of the other guys.
Right.
But more than that, he brings the mindset of what I think that Sean is looking for. The guy who's going to get here early, who's a team first guy, who's willing to just learn and soak up whatever he can. And then when on game day, just bring it. Right. That's what a Sean Payton kind of guy is. And that's what the Broncos are going to be looking for. And they got to find pieces like that. Undrafted guys.
Undrafted guys,
all those kinds of things help when you put them all together. That's what makes a winning football team.
Yeah. Phil, we talked to Jaleel, I think it was the last week of the season or 2 weeks left of the season. And I just remember him saying, how much he's going to miss this team.
Just being around the guys and being in the locker room. Guys who love football.
I know.
That's a big deal because it's a long season,
mindset,
And so
and at the end, he still wasn't ready for it to be over.
Love it. So, and part of that process is also saying, hey, this guy isn't a Bronco.
Right.
He's in the locker room right now, but that's not quite the kind of person we're looking for. As time goes on, the entire locker room will become what Sean Payton is looking for. And that just sort of helps your whole team out, just where you're like, I got everybody on the same page. Everybody's got the same mindset. Everybody's what we're looking for.
Right.
That's just how you win football games in the NFL.
That's true. Yeah.
It's a big deal.
Lots to look forward to this offseason. Lots going on this week, Pro Bowl, Senior Bowl, and then Super Bowl.
Yeah.
Things are chipping away here.
A lot going on. And, the last thing I'll say is just watching those games last weekend, you saw some critical mistakes from some of those guys. And you always hear Sean Payton preaching about details.
Right.
Even in the highest level. in the most stressful times, those details, they pop up. And if you're just not sharp about everything like that, it can cost you a chance to go to the Super Bowl, Sid. And so, just having,
Look at the Ravens.
That mindset where you're just like, hey, we can't afford to, skip over some of these minor little
details matter.
That it could really come back and hurt you. So, felt like some of those things popped up in both games last Sunday.
Yeah,
and so,
I agree.
It's more than just a saying when Sean's like, hey, when you see Sean out there, it's a Friday. People are looking to get out, but he's extending those practices, going over some of these little things. That kind of culture and that kind of mindset is what builds champions. So
he knows he's been
exactly
at the highest level of games.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that as time goes on and more off seasons go by, you're just going to see this Broncos team transformed. And a big part of that happened last year, just a shift in mindset, a shift in attitude. And I think that's going to continue with the type of players that they get in free agency, the type of players that they identify at the Senior Bowl, at the Shrine Game, these types of things, you're going to start to find out, okay, this is what a Sean Payton type of player is.
Yeah, I agree. I'm excited for it, Phil.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining the show today.
Always fun. Yeah. Thanks, Sid.
Well, that's going to do it for today's episode of Broncos Now. Broncos Country, thanks so much for tuning in. I'll meet you right back here on the Broncos Podcast Network and YouTube next week for another episode.